Well, getting married or divorced, buying or selling property, having children or retiring, or big life changes can also have a huge impact on your taxes. Joining us with tax filing tips and new developments in tax situation and tax law is Mark Stieber, Chief Tax Officer at Jackson Hewitt. Mark, good morning. Welcome to Better Kansas City. What's important for this year's tax season that we should know?
Well, this year is going to be a complex tax year, even though you may see some, messaging to the contrary that it wasn't a big year of tax law change compared to last year. That's simply not true. It was a big law change year, following up from the biggest tax law change in 30 years with some clarity on that law and rules. But two late legislative changes that happened at the last minute, which affects people who had some of those beloved extender provisions or disasters and casualties, or might have retirement plan activity, or a variety of others. So there were some tax law changes to be sure, but more importantly, Bill, I would tell you that life changes were big in 2019, and for taxpayers with their single largest financial transaction, coupled with tax law changes, their life changes, it's a robust year with opportunity for millions.
Let's talk about some of those life changes. What situations, can really impact the taxpayer's tax situation? I know some of them, like we mentioned at the beginning, buying or selling property, or, marriage or divorce or kids, right?
Well, those are the big ones, and those are kind of obvious for most taxpayers. You would know if you got married or divorced or had a child, or sold some big asset, you probably ought to look closely at that item. But when we look at tax returns and we look at people's life changes, the list is much bigger. Taking care of an older dependent parent, for example, that makes them your qualifying dependent can impact your tax return, and that's very common. Starting a small business or a side business, becoming self-employed partially or totally. Huge issues, and coupled with the law changes, can have a double impact on your tax return. Having someone go to higher education or college, also can have a big impact. So life changes are very important, and it's important that taxpayers bring those topics up to their tax pro, call it out, because if you don't, you may leave something off your tax return that can have a very positive impact on your tax refund. So tax law change is big, but life changes, I think, are even bigger.
Yeah, let's talk especially about one of those biggest changes is, like, you're talking a little bit about having children. How exactly do children affect the tax return, and then multiple children and declaring them as dependents? It just gets so confusing for me when I start filling out those forms.
Well, and not only that, if you have a complex family structure, which millions of Americans do with separated parents, and who gets custody and who gets to claim the dependent on their tax return, can have a doubling effect of complexity. But know this, of the life changes we talked about, married, divorced, bought a house, business, having a child has probably the most common and the biggest positive impact on a tax return. I'll just start with the child tax credit that's available to taxpayers who have a child on their tax return. It's $2,000 per child. There is a dependent care credit if you have a dependent that requires child care, daycare, or summer camp. There's education credits. There's changes in your filing status, filing tax rates, all which attach to the child on your tax return. So if you have a dependent, look for those benefits. If you split the dependent with a divorced spouse or separated spouse, make sure you and the spouse are in agreement and understand those rules, because you could be giving up thousands of dollars if you're not doing it properly. So a child can tremendously change your tax return the first year and successive years.
And you alluded to this at the very beginning, always changes in tax legislation. What's the biggest thing we should be looking for this year in terms of new legislation and tax law?
Well, the biggest is hard to say, because everything that touches you is the big thing. I would say there are new forms this year. There's a new 1040. There's a new 1040 for seniors. There's new attachments that were not there before. And at the end of the day, there's just a lot that a pro can help you out with. So find somebody you trust, somebody that's convenient, and somebody that knows your type of situation. That can pay dividends on your tax return with a bigger refund. All
right, Mark. Well, thanks for your time. We're still thinking about football here in Kansas City, but before you know it, we're going to have to think about filing those taxes. Thanks again. Belinda?
Big game coming.
That's right.